Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the next series of videos, we're going to be looking at the backup strategies that a production DBA must plan, test, and deploy. And we'll also be looking at the restore processes that a DBA is responsible for. So let's begin. Database backup strategies. One of the most important jobs that a production database has is the planning, testing, and deployment of a backup plan. It is critical to have redundancies of our data and databases, both the system databases and the user-defined databases, in case of either a minor catastrophe or a major catastrophe, or any kind of catastrophe for that matter. And ironically, when we plan the backup plan, we must take into account the restore strategy. This goes in hand, and it will be illustrated more as we get into a demonstration. So what is a backup plan? Well, the backup plan actually starts with what regarded as the restore strategy. Two leading questions that you must ask the upper management or the company are as follows. What is the maximum amount of data loss that can be tolerated? And what is the accepted time frame that the database has to be restored in case of a disaster? So what I mean by what is the maximum amount of data loss that can be tolerated when you're determining the backup strategy and the restore strategy is to ask the question, can I lose 1 day of data and is that fine? Can I lose 1 hour of data and is that fine? Or is it critical that we don't even lose a minute of data? And once you've answered those kind of questions, we'll be able to determine what kind of backup and restore strategy we can conduct for our company. And the next leading question that we'll ask is what is the accepted time frame if it should have a disaster? What is the time frame to be able to restore that database? Now, how much time do you have to restore it in the case of a disaster? Do you have a 1 day? Do you have 10 hours? Do you have 6 hours? And as you can see, as you go down and saying if you restore processes in 15 minutes, then we've got other technologies will have to come into our restore plan. So these are the two important questions that you must ask the upper management of the company, and it'll be your responsibility to deploy them and test and verify both the backup strategy and the restore strategy. So now let's look at some of, before we get into the backup plans, some of the questions we're involved in. So the first question we asked is, what is the accepted time frame for the database to be restored in case of a disaster? To answer that question, here is the answer. The first question involves taking multiple transaction log backups. And then the second question, which is what is the accepted time frame of the database to be restored in case of a disaster? The second question actually involves the use of HA solutions, such as database mirroring, log shipping, or high availability groups, and so on. So before we begin, let's ask the why, what, when, where, and who for the strategy, so it'll become clear as to the responsibilities and roles of each person, and most likely the production database administrator. So the first question we must ask, obviously, is why backup? Well, backups are taken in order to be able to restore the database to its original state just before the disaster and protect against the following reasons. Now, obviously, you want backups because if any of these following reasons occur, then you should be able to restore the database just before the disaster occurs. And the types of scenarios that can cause you to take backups are hardware failures, malicious damage by the user, or even user error where a user accidentally deletes a table or updates a table without the where clause. And obviously we can have database corruption itself. So these are some of the leading reasons why you need a backup, a solid, valid backup. So in case any of these happens, we can always resort back to the backup. So what is a backup then? Well, simply put, it's an image of the database at the time of the full backup. So for example, if you have a database and you have, let's say, for example, if you have a single table with 100 rows and 100 entries, if I were to take a full backup of that time, then I would have an exact copy of the database. And now this not only includes the 100 rows in the table, but also the loggings, the configurations, and etc. So it's not just the database and the tables that we're concerned with, it's also the schema of the database that is fully protected by the full backup. So simply put, it's an image of whatever the database has inside at that time. There are several types and different kinds of backups that we'll be looking at and demonstrating in the coming series. So let's look at a few of them. What is the full backup? Well, a full backup is a complete page-by-page copy of the entire database, including all the data, as I mentioned, all the structures, all the schemas, and all the objects and the store procedures within the database. So as I said, it's an exact copy at that time. So that's a great thing to have, is a full database backup. There is a database called differential backup. And a differential backup is as follows: a backup of the database that has been modified in any way since the last full backup. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you have a table with 10 rows and you take a full database backup, now you have a snapshot of that table with 10 rows. If now I modify that table and add a single row, the insert, and now we have 11 rows, and if I were to take a differential backup, that differential backup will take the difference between the full backup, which was 1 to 10 rows, and now we'll take that snapshot of that 11th row, which is the difference between the last backup. And this will become clearer as we discuss them individually and give examples. So what is a transactional log backup? Obviously, we've discussed this in detail in the previous videos, but a transactional log is a backup of all committed transactions currently in the transactional logs. So remember what a transactional log is. A transactional log records all the modifications of the database, and a transactional log captures all those transactions. There's a newer version called in the newer versions of SQL, the latest versions, I believe in 2008 and upwards, there's a copy-only backup. This primarily states that you can take a backup of the database without interrupting for example, if you had a job that was running a full database backup and transactional log backups, those two must be in sync. And I'll explain that later. But if you were to take a regular backup, that sync, if you will, or that chain will be broken. This copy-only backup prevents that. So I'll show you that in a second also. There's also file backups, which is a backup of one or more database file or file groups. And then obviously there's a partial backup, which contains data from only some of the file groups and data. The most common ones are obviously the first three here, the full database backup, the differential backup, and transactional log backup. And then obviously I'll be demonstrating these four for you individually. So the next question now is, when do you back up? Again, this is a company decision that may be determined by asking the following questions. And it's the same questions that we ask. What is the maximum amount of time data loss can be tolerated? Obviously, again, if our company cannot lose data, then we're going to have a tremendous amount of transactional log backups, virtually every 15 minutes or every minute. Or if that is not tolerable, then we'll have to bring in other technologies. And what is the accepted time frame of the database can be restored? Again, if this answer is, if the data is seemed critical and we don't have any time to restore, then other technologies come in. But if we have, for example, 5-6 hours, then we can obviously certainly use the full database backup, differential backups, and transactional log backups to restore the database just before it crashes. So this is an important question, but again, it depends on the company and your circumstances. And just to address that, the first question will address the use of the transactional logs, as I said, and their frequency, as I mentioned. And then the second question will involve HA solutions. So that's what I just mentioned. Where should the database backups be placed? That's a critical decision to be made. Ideally, the backups should be placed on their own drives, on separate servers from the production server. That is critical. You do not want to take backups on a production server, as this can cause performance issues. And then you should also use a third-party application that copies the data and then places it on a separate site or other remote servers. The whole idea of having backups is to have redundancies not only on the local computer, but on the second or third computers, and then on separate sites if possible. And this is important, and we'll be discussing that also. What should not be tolerated, this is important, is to have the backups on the same drive and on the same server as the data and the log files. So while you can have the data files and the transactional log files on a server but separate drives, you should certainly not have the backups. Basically, you're putting all eggs in one basket, and that can be dangerous. So, and obviously, it's dangerous because if the server crashes, we lose all hopes of retaining the critical data. So what needs to be backed up? Well, we've said this briefly before, but all user-defined databases, any databases the production database administrator creates, you should have a backup plan, and all the system databases which we've mentioned, which are the model database, master database, and the MSD database. And who should perform these operations and backup procedures? Well, obviously, this is the responsibility of the database administrator. The person in charge of the backup planning and execution will most likely be the production database administrator. This is why you're taking this course and learning about it. You will be the key person in coordinating with the upper management and providing direct and valuable advice as to the best practice to be able to restore the database in case of a disaster. So this is something that you will do. And as we will note, and as I will demonstrate, even though I will demonstrate manually how to back up and using the GUI backups. However, in a production environment, most likely you will be using the SQL jobs to automate this process and make your life a little easier. There's also a couple of other questions that you must ask when you're talking about the backup plan, and that is the backup retention period. And that means how long can you have the backups if you've taken a backup, full backup day one, and then the next week comes and you take another full backup, and then the third week and fourth week and so forth, and you're continuously taking full database backups. The question is, how long do you want to keep those? Again, those are based on a decision based on your company needs. So I would advise you to talk with your upper management in making that decision. But again, you will be the key person in deciding how long it keeps, because it's a space is an issue also. Performing backups. There are several ways, obviously, to perform the backups. You can use the following methods that I'm going to illustrate to you, obviously, as always, is using a T-SQL backup script and then using the GUI backup, and I'll be demonstrating that to you also. But again, most likely you will be performing backups using the SQL agent and automating this process. So now I think I'm going to leave it here because this is an important concept to understand. The where, why, what, and who of the backup plan. And now you get a sense of the importance of backup strategy, in that if a disaster should happen, or if you need to restore a database, it always starts off with having a full database backup and or a differential backup and or a transactional log backups. That must be in place, it must be verified, it must be valid. And I'll be going into those concepts in the next video. So I think I'm going to leave it here. I advise you to kind of reread this and mull it over. Just understand the who, where, what, and why, and the importance of a backup plan. So the next video, I'm actually going to create a database and take a full database backup and demonstrate to you both using the GUI and the transactional log, transactional T-SQL. So I will leave it there, and this is Raphael with How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. See you in the next video.